guess I'll start. Thank you all for coming out. It's really nice to see you all. It's really great to be here. Like James said, I have spent a lot of time researching the history of the Headquarters Plaza project, and I was probably here every week researching things for about 2.5 to 3 years. So James got, and I would find that in researching that story, there would be things I would stumble across, like the League of Women Voters, and I thought, well, that's not really part of the story of the Headquarters Plaza project. I'm going to put that on the back burner. And then I'd come back around and go, I think it might have been. I think the League of Women Voters might have been part of that story. So I spent some time researching their archives, which are here, which are fantastic. And then I thought I should share that, but then I wanted to expand it to talk about the spectacular women of Morristown. I do have to give credit where credit is due. Some of you might have recognized the phrase Dauntless Crusaders. It's not mine. It's from the Sherman Brothers. It's from Sister Suffragette in Mary Poppins. You remember that song where Mrs. Banks is dancing around Dauntless Crusaders? So that's the Sherman Brothers line, but the spectacular women of Morristown are very aptly described as Dauntless Crusaders. And the plan for the evening is to talk about some of these extraordinary women and then open up the conversation to other people that you feel should also be celebrated. The span of time that I'm going to talk about is roughly 1860 to 1970, so certainly lots of folks that we could continue to talk about after the official sort of presentation is done. Feel free to reach, if you want to continue the conversation afterwards, feel free to reach out to me by email on Instagram at Morristown Project. That's mainly dedicated to the Headquarters Plaza story. And don't get me started on that, because we'll be here till next year. If you'll allow me, I want to begin with a woman who's not actually a Morristown woman, and just bear with me for 2 minutes. How many of you have ever heard of Harriet Jacobs? Okay, so Harriet Jacobs wrote one of the most important works in American literature, which is The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's a slave narrative. It was published in 1861. And it's an absolutely extraordinary text. I used to have my students read it when I was a high school teacher. And the reason why I bring it up is because Harriet was enslaved in the South and managed to get to the North, where she was employed by a family that was as a nanny. And then that family, the Willis family, ran Idlewild, which was a writer's colony in New York. And the writers there talked to Harriet and heard about her story, and they encouraged her to write her story. And her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, became the most important text to come out of Idlewild. And that family, the Willis family, and the child that she helped to mind when she was employed as a nanny was Grinnell Willis, who donated the money for the construction of this building. So when I found out that Harriet Jacobs was connected to Grinnell Willis and connected to the story of this building, I was like, this is unbelievable that this woman was tied to Morristown through that connection to the family. She stayed friends with the family. Her children were friends with their children. So she was more than just a nanny. She was one of their friends. So that's pretty neat. But anyway, so starting with her, moving on to Julia Keyes Collis, who's definitely a Morristown person. I gave a talk in the spring on the Collis family, and I mentioned her in some of the comments at the end. She married the youngest of the Collis children, who the Collises built the Kellogg Club a couple blocks away. And Julia Keyes Collis is an interesting person because when she was married to the youngest Collis, he decided he wanted to develop the neighborhood, right? So this is the map from 1886. You can see that really lightly written at the top. This was his plan for developing the historic district, right? So this is Wetmore, this is Collis Ave, there's Farragut. This map is here at the library, so in case you want to look at it. If you notice, like Wetmore on his idea didn't end in the dead end at the end there. It kind of went down, turned banked left. I checked Google Earth, that's still just trees, still just woods back there. There's nothing developed. The original plan, as he saw it, was he had a gas works up here. They were going to supply gas lines and electricity gas lines and water to all of the building lots. They were going to put All Souls Hospital down here, and this was going to be like a whole neighborhood. The problem was 1886, the year this was created, was also the year that George left Julia and hightailed it into New York City and left her with the plans, the debt, the mortgages, and none of the money needed to finish this project. So she was pretty destitute and didn't know what to do. She wrote her son letters. He was studying at Yale. She said, what do I do? You know, he's like, well, Ma, you can get a job. And she said, well, I don't know what people would pay me for. It turned out that she was incredibly well-read and incredibly intelligent. So she made a living giving lectures in people's homes on like Shakespeare and Spencer. And she ended up becoming the chair of the social science department at Rutgers, Douglas College. And she so very much like rose from the ashes. This is the picture of All Souls Hospital that she did actually manage to move down to the end of the property. And then she wrote a book, Authors and Writers Associated with Morristown, with a chapter on historic Morristown. It's very much like a Reader's Digest kind of book. Not too gripping of a plot, but well done indeed for Julia to sort of get out of the straits that she was in and her husband left her in. She was in town at a time that there was a lot of bold-faced names, a lot of wealthy people. She was not so much in the mix of the social scene. One woman that was Mary Ellen Gridley Twining, who I'm imagining you've never heard of, probably because she mainly appears in most of the history texts as Mrs. Kinsley Twining, which is a fantastic name. Kinsley Twining was a minister, and he was very well known in Massachusetts. He was a very prominent minister. He was hired to come to Morristown. They come in the 1880s, 1890s, and at that time, the Hollow was an Italian neighborhood, right? And Mrs. Kinsley Twining and her friends were concerned about that fact. And so they got together. This is the executive committee for the Association for Work Among the Italians. And Mrs. Kinsley Twining's name is there. The Burnhams and the Caldwells and the Pitneys. They're the bold-faced names. You'll see Julia Keys-Callis not on that list, right? She's not quite in the mix. But they decided that they were going to do something along the lines of Jane Edwards' settlement house. They were going to do something about this Italian community. They solicited donations, and you'll see like Mrs. Gustav E. Kissel was a Vanderbilt descendant. She lived at Wheatsheaf on the Sussex Avenue part of town. That's her. She gave $10. Mrs. Otto Kahn, Adelaide, who lived in the mansions where Honeywell is Honeywell still there? No, right? It's like Red Bull complex and some condos. They had mansions there. She gave $25. The Freelinghuisens gave $5. And all of the folks you would expect to contribute to this initiative pitched in. They decided, Mrs. Kinsley Twining had a garden club that she funded through a fair at her house. They had medical professionals help the folks in the neighborhood. They had a guidebook, which is here at the library. You can read it. It's really fascinating. Like, have you always been so stout? Which I won't do. I did that. I put that phrase into Google Translate and it translated current day as have you always been fat. But so dizziness. Do you have a persistent cough? Do you have hemorrhoids? Main questions you need to ask people. But so they were really intending to do good work among this community. There was a little bit of tension, perhaps, in the fact that this was a group of mainly Protestant women working in a mainly Catholic community. And they did have a missionary, they did have religious classes, there might have been some pressure to maybe convert. And there might have been a little bit of arrogance on the part of the folks running this settlement house. And it came to a head in 1914, on the night of March 12th. So the folks who were working in this association decided to put on a display of photographs of their work on South Street. And they had pictures of the families they were working with, and they had stories about the things they had done. And at the same time, Burton Wiley, whose son Steve has the statue outside, who was the superintendent of schools. And Burton Wiley had a question posed to him about the Italian children. And having been an educator, I can sort of put it in modern parlance. I think it was something along the lines of how we're going to meet the needs of these students. He may have said something along the lines of we're going to provide remediation or direct instruction or whatever it was you would call it today. The way it was translated is it came across as we're going to put the Italians in their own classes and we're going to separate them from the other children. And it also was a time when Morristown was beginning to see people come north as part of the Great Migration, and so he also said, and we're going to do that same type of remediation with the students who are black. And so the Italians were like, we're going to have our children segregated along racial lines, and they didn't appreciate that. And 200 parents came together on Flagler Street, and they marched to Burton Wiley's office, and they demanded an audience with him, and he very graciously took in about 10 or 12 of them, and then the other almost 200 didn't have anywhere to go, so they went to this social welfare show on South Street, and young Pellegrino Venezio found a picture of his wife and daughter above the caption, "The Italian man doesn't know how to take care of his children." And all hell broke loose. And they ripped the pictures off the walls, they destroyed the show. It made the front cover of the New York Times in 1914, the social uplift show, wrecked in Jersey. A crowd of Morristown Italians invades health exhibit and destroys pictures. Pellegrino got arrested and he had a $250 fine for basically rioting. But all of this is the backstory of the neighborhood house. So this became, and the Morristown Association for Work Among the Italians became the neighborhood house, and all their archives are here, so really cool stuff. Okay, so Allison Lowe Turnbull Hopkins was also part of the mix. I think one of her daughters worked at the neighborhood house. She lived on Featherleaf Farms, which I think was over by the Morse Museum, and she was a suffragette. And what makes her sort of unique is that she was part of the radical branch of the suffragettes, and she was with Alice Paul, and they believed that they should hold the people in power accountable for women not having the right to vote. So the problem was her husband was running Woodrow Wilson's re-election campaign, and she, in this picture over here, is pictured as being actively campaigning against Wilson. So you see, she had a car and she drove all the way out to Springfield, Illinois, where William Jennings Bryan was speaking, and she got her car in the motorcade behind William Jennings Bryan with big banners saying, "Don't vote for Wilson." Right? So a little bit of tension there at home with her husband who was running Wilson's campaign. In 1917, Allison Lowe Turnbull Hopkins and Alice Paul and others went to DC and demanded an audience with Wilson, and they got arrested. And they were thrown in the Occupam workhouse. There's Allison there. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners. They were not. They demanded to have other clothing that they wanted to keep for their own. They were refused that. Eventually, the people who were imprisoned went on a hunger strike, and they were forced fed, like the Iron-Jawed Angels. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. Allison sort of managed to bypass all of that because her husband, the day after she was arrested, he called Wilson, and Wilson pardoned her. So she was let out of jail the day after she was arrested. She was pissed that she was not allowed to stay in prison. So she wanted to be part of it. So she went to the White House every day after that, demanding an audience and demanding to speak with Wilson and demanding that women have the right to vote. She was not arrested again. Her marriage did not last, surprisingly. She eventually moves to New York City and joins a group called the Heterodoxy, which is a group of like strong-minded women who their only qualification to be in the group was you had to have a strongly held belief and be able to defend it. I've seen Allison Lowe Turnbull Hopkins celebrated in spaces dedicated to LGBTQ history. I don't know if that's just because they were big fans or because she was a member of the community. I don't know, but worth noting. Anyway.
Is she in Stuffs, the musical on Broadway?
I don't know.
I think she might be,
I
because
think-
the hunger strike is in there, and
Yeah.
I think they talk about one or two of the women getting out,
Yeah.
because of war.
She's definitely a pistol. I mean, I could see where she would have been. She was the head of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in New Jersey, so she's a powerhouse. And to have such proximity to Wilson would seem, I think she should be. If she wasn't specifically, she should be. So at the same time, and a much more, not on a sort of changing gears, changing tacks a little bit, so away from politics to the arts, Helen Hagen lived in Morristown in 1920, 1932. She was a composer. She was the first Black woman to graduate from Yale University with a degree in music. She composed a piano concerto in C minor that still exists today, and Yale just recently had an event celebrating her and recreating a performance of the piece. She was married to Dr. John T. Williams, and she was the first woman member of Morristown's Chamber of Commerce, because she gave lessons from her office on North Park Place. She was very much a part of the cultural life of Morristown. She gave concerts, she put on concerts at the Lyceum, she put on concerts at Morristown High School. This is an article about a concert that she organized marking the 63rd anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. She had the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Choral Society that she led in town. She eventually, I love this is her stationery from her office in Park Square building in Morristown. This is a letter in 1932 she wrote to Dr. W.B. Du Bois asking for his help into where she could get money so she could spend more time composing and less time giving lessons. But you just think about how extraordinary. One of the things that's in this, although you can't really see it, is that at this celebration, Burton Wiley recited a poem as part of the celebration. So kind of cool. Anyway, okay. This is a very short slide. This is about Alice Parker. There's not a lot of information about her. You can see this is her name down here. She was a Black woman who lived in Morristown. She is credited for creating the first gas-fired forced air heating system. This is not her. The reason why I put this picture here is because if you Google her name, this picture will show up. This is not her. This is a white woman. And this is from like 1942, you can tell from the hairstyle. But you see her, if you Google her name and you see her, just know that it's the wrong picture. Alice Butler lived in Morristown. In the census, she's listed as working as a maid, and her husband is working as a butler. Unfortunately, she passed away relatively young in a fire, so it might have been that she was experimenting or trying to refine this invention that she created, but there are scholarships dedicated to her and societies that celebrate her, even though very little is known about her, and there's certainly no photograph that anybody has yet to share with the world. Okay, now this is curious. How many of you remember Ruth Cheney Streeter? Okay, fantastic, because she lived until 1990. I don't remember her, but I'm curious what memories you have. So Ruth Cheney Streeter, as some of you already know, was the head of the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserves during World War II. And part of how she got that job was because she had lost brothers in World War I and became dedicated to trying to help in what she saw as coming to World War II. She taught herself to fly. She bought herself a plane. She wanted to be part of the Air Force, the Women's Auxiliary of the Air Force. They were like, you're 15 years too old. She was 47 at the time. She eventually becomes the head of this Women's Auxiliary. And within the span of like 2 or 3 years, marshals a corps of 19,000 women supporting the Marines. And one of the reasons why you may never have heard about the Marine Corps Women's Reserve is because it didn't have a catchy nickname, right? Because there's like the WACs and the Waves and the other auxiliaries. They didn't have any nicknames, and she might have like stamped that down because some of the suggestions for the nicknames were Femarines, the Whams, the Bams, the Dainty Devil Dogs, the Glamourines, the women's leatherneck aids, the Mars, and the Submarines, which she was not fond of any of those. One of the things that she had to do was to convince parents that it was okay for their daughters to join the Corps, and she was always, just her picture here and here. She wrote in a letter to the women recruits, and she said, "It's not easy to free a Marine to fight," which was the tagline for their Corps. So it takes courage, the courage to embark on a new and an alien way of life. Your spirit is a source of constant inspiration to all who work with you, which I thought was a great line. When Ted France posted that this talk was going to happen in his Facebook group, somebody wrote that they remembered Mrs. Streeter because they worked on her car at their garage, and she was not a woman you wanted to keep waiting. Well, of course not. She wanted to run the women's auxiliary over the Marines. She's not somebody who would wait, you know. Anyway, so curious what other stories we have of her. But, okay, so at the same time, Mary Crane Home, anybody remember her?
I knew her.
Fantastic, super cool. So she grew up in Acorn Hall, and she was an actress. This is her, I guess her headshot, and then this is her appearing in King Lear. She was, Acorn Hall is now, like, she dedicated her home to the Morris County Historical Society. She gave it to the Morris County Historical Society and moved to her home on Nantucket. And it's dedicated to Victorian. It's a Victorian showpiece, but she had a much more dynamic, adventurous life. She attended the Democratic Convention in 1920. She wrote a song, "Let's re-elect Roosevelt." She attended the creation of the United Nations. She worked for an organization that wanted a world federalist government. So very, very progressive, very sort of, maybe beyond her time, but also committed to the Historic Society, committed to historical preservation, was not a big fan of Route 287, which brings us to the League of Women Voters, who also did not like Route 287. This whole idea for this talk came from reading through the records of the League of Women Voters, and one of the things that they did was they kept very, Joe Carruthers, who was the head of it for a while, remarked that they engaged in civic activity through satirical poetry and direct action. And so this is one example of one of their newsletters, and the poetry, this is Alice Ginsler's introduction of herself to everybody else in the league, and she said, "I'm a native New Yorker of yore. I enjoy life suburban much more. I prefer Morris Plains, though there are no sewer drains. We are told that they may be in store." And this group of women was in this particularly singular moment of having been highly educated, but then also expected not to be employed after they got married. And so you can see this is their bulletin from 1970, January of 1970. They had lectures, Black Experience in America. They had deep dives into planning, like urban planning, town planning. They had a sort of a unit, they called their meetings units, on fiscal policies, consensus on foreign and economic policy. And this is a stunning document, because they were like, okay, if you come to the home of Mrs. Garrett Hobart IV, it's a block, Farragut is a block west of Miller, which is right off of South Street. So they're just inviting each other to their homes to have these conversations and these meetings. And they're incredibly engaged, and one of them, Elizabeth Throckmorton Cook, anybody remember her? Awesome. Learned yesterday that she just went by Betty Cook, which is a much easier name to sort of get around. But Elizabeth Throckmorton Cook lived in the Grove, which is the house to the left of Assumption School, if you look at that. And she was a huge fan of Mount Vernon. So this is her with Gerald Ford and Leader of France at a dedication for a ceremony at Mount Vernon. She very famously opposed the construction of 287 and climbed into the scoop of the bulldozer that was attempting to knock down one of the houses. And the reporter said she had a police officer came and told her to move. And she was elderly at the time, right? So she responded that she was not going to move. And the reporter said that she had a voice that sounded like tea being poured out of a very expensive saucer pot or whatever. So it's absolutely fascinating. The house she eventually does get, and that other part of that is sitting next to her in the scoop of the bulldozer was Mrs. Garrett Hobart, Judy, who at the time when she climbed into the scoop, turned to her husband and said, "Is it okay if I get arrested, dear?" Which, you always have to get permission. Anyway, so in that group, and perhaps the sort of, one of the most successful members of that League of Women Voters was Anne Klein, who I'm sure you all also, some of you remember. The reason why I say she was most successful is because she became the head of the New Jersey branch of the League of Women Voters. And then she represented the town in the assembly, and then she ran for governor. And she didn't win the governorship, but Governor Byrne, who did win, asked her what she wanted to do as part of his administration, and she said she wanted to work basically at the Department of Human Services. She wanted to shut down Trenton State Prison. She thought it was inhumane. And she eventually does, and she there's a facility in Trenton named for her, for folks who are dealing with substance abuse issues. I love this is her political campaign ad, and there she is on the phone, which I'm sure she probably spent so much time on the phone. She's profiled in New York Times 1975 as one of the women who runs the state. And in that article, there is a piece, they recreate a poem she wrote about New Jersey. And it's G is for this and A is for that, like Garden State. I won't read you the whole thing, but I thought it's not that far off, right? So for the state part of Garden State, she said, S is for her surplus ever shrinking. T is fiscal trouble just beyond. A is all the water we'll be drinking. T is total interest on her bonds. E is each economy we cherish, also each and every unmet need. Lord, protect and never let her perish, the garden state that blooms amid the weeds. So not that off from where we are today. But another woman, what happens in the League of Women Voters, which is really fascinating, is in the middle part of the 1970s, it sort of splits from the League's focus on income tax and redistricting and sort of very, I guess, less sort of challenging political issues. And then along comes the National Organization of Women, and that is much more interested in digging into more controversial topics. And so the National Organization of Women has a conference in 1974, and they're talking about gay rights, and they're talking about abortion. And there's also the very real, stress placed on the fact that women in 1974 can't have a credit card on their own, they can't get loans on their own. There is a marital exception to rape, and so you couldn't claim your husband had raped you because that was not illegal. And the issue of domestic violence became the front and center issue for Judy Todd and others. And they started a network of homes where if you were a victim of domestic violence, you could reach this hotline and they would connect you with a woman who would bring you into her home and you could have a safe place to sleep. And eventually that became too overwhelming, and they wanted to have a separate place where women could seek shelter. So they created they created the Jersey Battered Women's Shelter. And this is the original document. Their signatures, Mary Ann McCabe, who we all know and love, who's a librarian here, and Judy Todd are listed on there. The three women that I want to talk about next are, there is not currently a statue in Morris County of a woman, not a single one. And if I could place my thumb on the scale, I would have the next three women I talk about be a counterpoint to the statues on the green with like Washington and Hamilton and Lafayette. Like these three women should be on the opposite corner. Like I would love that. But anyway, nobody's asking me. So the first woman is Jane Edwards, and I am completely in awe of her. She is pictured here in the middle of this banner headline. This is from 1965. This is a night when people, this is Chris Martin, Neil Corte, this is John King, that's David Noonan. They were asking the aldermen to do something about the housing in the Hollow and how it was substandard. And Jane Edwards was demanding that they do something right away. The summer of 1965 is a particularly contentious time in Morristown, and if James lets me come back, that'll be my next topic of conversation, is the summer of 1965. Because Jane Edwards was determined to do something about housing and to improve the situation, and she created the Pocahontas Tenants Association. She connected with the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church in the summer of 1965 decided it wanted to recruit kids from all over, colleges all over the country, and send them into towns to help community organize. And in the summer of 1965, they chose two towns, Watts in Los Angeles and Morristown. And yeah, wild, right? And that was the summer that Watts rioted, that Watts burned. And Morristown didn't, obviously. But it's fascinating. There are a number of rallies. This is Mrs. Edwards at one of the rallies. There was a shooting involving the police. It got very tight, very tense. One of the things that Mrs. Edwards did throughout that summer and beyond was really focus on communication. And she created, along with her friends, created the Hollow Area Report to the People. This is, there are a number of these still at Drew. You can see this is, Jane Edwards wrote a column about why Connie Montgomery should be chosen for the Board of Education. And Mrs. Edwards worked for a good number of years as a housekeeper. And some of the people whose houses she worked at were part of the League of Women Voters. And when she eventually left that profession to become a social worker with the Urban League, those women found that they didn't know nearly as much of what was going on in town because Mrs. Edwards wasn't coming to their house every week and letting them know all the skinny. So the League of Women Voters, after she pursues another career, they start attending town council meetings and keeping notes of everything that's happening. And they sit in the back of those meetings like the Furies in judgment of the people in power. And there's also, at the time, Reverend Williams at Bethel AME Church started a newspaper to try to fill in the gap of the communication network that was lost when Mrs. Edwards pursued social work full time. Most of what Mrs. Edwards did, she did with her friend Julia Kersey, who is the second woman in my triumvirate. And Julia Kersey, whose grandson is here with us today. So I know you remember her. So was tireless, absolutely tireless in her connection, her commitment to Morristown. And just briefly, right, just a quick list. She was a social worker at the Urban League. She started the Pocahontas Child Care Center. She worked for the National Council on Aging, the Morristown Senior Center. She was on the board of the Girl Scouts. She was on the board of the Morristown Welfare Board, the Fair Housing Council, Concerned Citizens of the Second Ward, the Housing Authority, the Union Baptist Church, and St. Margaret's. And she was a reader and a great-grandmother. Now, the other thing that's not included in that list, in that very amazing list, was one of my favorite stories about her, was that if you're going down MLK towards the monstrosity that is the Headquarters Plaza Project, Flagler Street, you can't cut up Flagler Street to get to Speedwell. But back in the day, people were doing that, and Mrs. Kersey did not want that to be happening. So she got all of her friends in their overcoats in December, and just stood in the street and demanded everybody turn around until the police had to get involved and take over the job that she was doing, because she was just out there physically putting herself in the place that change needed to happen, which I think is a good representation of what she was all about. And the third person in my group would be Bea Jenkins. And Beatrice Jenkins is most famous for being the lead plaintiff in the merger case that brought Morristown and Morris Township public schools together. And she was president of the Urban League at the time, and she was this picture I love, absolutely love. She was eventually elected to the town council. This is the town council from 1974. This is David Edwards, Jane Edwards' son. There's Paul Hoyt, with some other, Donald Crescitello. Like, I love that picture. But that's in 1974. I skipped past the school merger. But just back up to that. Bea Jenkins was determined that Morris Township was not going to leave Morris School District. And in the Jenkins case, it's one of the only cases in the history of the country where a court decided that the somewhat arbitrary lines of municipal demarcation were not as important as the social goal of bringing communities together. And they determined that Morristown and Morris Township were one community, and the children should be educated as such. And they quoted in their decision, they quoted the Regents of New York that said, if children of different races and economic and social groups have no opportunity to know each other and to live together in school, they cannot be expected to gain the understanding and mutual respect necessary for the cohesion of our society. The stability of our social order depends in large measure on the understanding and respect which is derived from a common educational experience among diverse racial, social, and economic groups. So Bea Jenkins is forever connected to that amazing, momentous case. Another moment in Bea Jenkins' life was when she was president of the council in 1977, when the Headquarters Plaza developer went bankrupt and they had to start all over again. And the ditch, you all remember the ditch in the middle of town, was going to be filled by something new. And there's everybody again looking at this potential plan. One of the things that happened at that point was that nobody really had any energy left to talk about the Headquarters Plaza project, and they were going to pick a new developer, and nobody really cared, and nobody really showed up. And Bea Jenkins said, I wish people cared more. After all, it is their money, which she nailed it. So, absolutely spectacular woman. So, who else should we celebrate? Who else? Oh, I know, before I'm going to get started, I'll start first. Who else did I leave out of the list? Betty Simmons, Jill Cook, Marge Brady, right? Some of the people that I've spent some wonderful time with, who I'm in awe of. But who else? And what other stories do you have to share about Mrs. Streeter and anybody else? Who else do you want to celebrate? Yeah.
I was surprised you didn't mention Caroline Foster.
Okay. Okay. So James, the library is named after her. The archives are named after her. So what strikes you as what do you remember, or what do you want to share about her for a minute?
Well, I remember her as a very old lady in cars and parades in town.
Okay.
But she founded the golf club.
Okay.
That was for women only.
Okay.
That later men took over.
The Morris County Golf Club.
Yeah, made into the Morris County Golf Club. But that was originally a women's golf club.
Yeah.
And she really ran that farm with her father. Her mother died when she was I used to volunteer there. So,
very cool.
Yeah, but she was an important figure in the town. And, who was her friend? Parson Todd, which she was always with her.
Parsons Todd. I didn't know they were friends. All right.
Oh, yeah, they were
Good to
very
know.
close friends. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, she's
Parsons
just
Todd's a great
character.
character, by the way. Top of mind, billionaire. Yeah. Curious.
We have Nina and Anna Howlands who started the Morristown Golf Club, and the other woman there, scrapbooks. They're interesting. And the records of Morristown Golf Club.
Warren, can you speak about your grandma for a minute?
I don't know if you remember my grandmother, but she was a fierce advocate, she was an activist. She got that from her father, who was active here in Morristown, in politics in the 1920s and 1930s. He actually was the first black in Morris County to run for the New Jersey State Senate. He just ran as a black horse candidate to pull votes from the Republicans. But he was quite a fierce advocate back in the time when Mayor Fox was mayor here in town. They had many run-ins. He was a true voice for the voiceless. So it's no wonder why my grandmother was the fierce advocate that she was. But like Kate mentioned, always on the firing line, always writing some sort of editorial, something in the newspaper, marching up to town hall to talk about, people in the hollow and what was being done and how this plaza was built. They were kind of put in the shadows. Growing up, I used to go to town meetings with her, and I used to watch the councilmen just put their heads down because they knew she was coming with something fierce. But she was the greatest woman that I ever known.
Awesome.
And she kind of inspired me to want to get in the field of service. I am an educator here in the Morristown district, and a few years back we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Morristown district. And as we were kind of digging through that history, it was really humbling to see that she was one of the trailblazers that kind of helped with the merger. She was on the lay organization for the Committee on Integration, which brought about the merger. At the time of the merger, she worked with the League, which actually got the merger started. And Jenkins, who she worked very closely with. So she was a phenomenal woman, and did so much. Loved Morristown. Did not want to leave here. When my grandfather was living, he kind of wanted to move out to Chester, to the rural areas. She said, absolutely not. I'm not leaving Morristown. It's my home. I have people that I have to, fight for and, value their cause. And that's what she did up until she died, at the age of 86. She was phenomenal.
Awesome. And then list that I read before of all those things, that was every evening she had to be out of the house.
Oh yeah, even like I said, I lived with her growing up, and she was still a social worker there with me. She'd come home, drop her bags down, and be at some sort of meeting. As Kate mentioned, she was at one point, it was said that she was on every board in Morristown.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know how she found the time to actually even do everything that she did, but she did. It was her life's work. It's what got her up in the morning. And that's who she was. She was a
Very cool.
advocate, and she just believed that she was her brother and sister's keeper, and that's our responsibility for our fellow man. She truly loved humanity, So that was who she was. Do many of you in here remember my grandmother? No.
Yeah. Aww. None of those meetings were by Zoom either. There wasn't
No.
There wasn't like just phoning it in.
No.
You had to actually
You had to
be
go.
there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So who else? James has one.
Dr. Felicia James.
Yes.
The first,
Yeah.
the first African American Morristown School District superintendent.
She worked for the Moore School District for a while. Yeah. She was part of that celebration of the merger, and she came back to speak, right? So it's very cool. Who else? Any stories about Colonel Streeter?
Cassandra.
Sandra McCabe, yes, Mary Ann McCabe. Ann McCabe. I just had lunch with her yesterday. I was thinking about, she definitely would probably blanch at the thought of me talking about her, which is, if you are unfamiliar with Mary Ann McCabe, what she did in the 60s and 70s as part of the League of Women Voters was she would write letters to the editor, sign them Cassandra McCabe, like the Trojan priestess who was gifted with perfect foresight but cursed to have nobody believe her. And she was right pretty much most of the time. And back to what you're saying, Lauren, I wanted to mention that every single time there was an event in the story of the construction of the headquarters plaza, your grandmother was there. Like she's just in every meeting at every single event. So there were other people that I was thinking about including Marge Brady, who I had the pleasure of interviewing a few years ago as part of the story of the Headquarters Plaza project, and I swear my ears were burning by the end of it. I had so much, she told me so much dirt about so many people that if I ever write this story and ever get it published, I will not be able to include any of it. I was like, it's fascinating. But yeah, I'm sure you also probably heard all of those same stories. So those of you that knew her. Okay, any other thoughts? Any other folks that are part of Morristown's firmament?
Kate, you need to tell folks what the Morristown project is.
Oh, it's just the story. I mean, I have pieced together the story of the Morristown project, and Colleen has read pretty much all of it. Yeah. So it is a tale worth telling. If you check it out on Instagram, a lot of the pictures, a lot of the story is there. But anyway, the other person who I think is an absolute amazing human being is Pam Hasagawa, who is here with us. Another complete bright star in the firmament. As you know, Linnea, do you want to talk about your mom for a minute? Putting you on the spot. I can do it.
Yeah.
So, not only is Pam an incredibly impressive photographer and tremendous humanitarian, but also lived an extraordinary life and has some great tales to tell, and also managed to give a tremendous gift to thousands upon thousands of people by making sure that adoption records are no longer sealed behind ridiculous and unnecessary and damaging restrictions. And that was an incredible odyssey to make that happen. And the story continues because there's a lot still going on and you're still discovering. That is something that Linnea texted me about just to tell me, and I haven't heard the whole story yet, but I know it's still going on. But truly phenomenal. And I've known you most of my life, which is really cool. And so that's been a gift. So, anybody else? No? All right. So I've already said who I would vote for in terms of a statue of women. Who would you pick among the folks we've talked about? Who should be the first statue of a woman? Maybe who would start with Colonel Streeter? Yeah, awesome, fantastic. How about Allison Lowe Turnbull Hopkins? So a couple votes for her. No? All right, I'm just going to assume you're all with me on the triumvirate of the three women at the end. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it.